The 5 men who portaged into Cain Gutslow in November of 1911 came out as one, and the 4 who did not leave no graves behind them, only a sealed record, and a buckle pressed so deep into slough mud that the initials, stamped into its face, came out of the earth like a name being spoken. The deposition Alcide Fontenot gave to the Terrebonne Parish Inquest Board 9 days after he walked out of the Atchafalaya Basin runs to 41 handwritten pages, and every page of it was locked inside a cedar box in the presiding judge's chambers before the month was out, where it remained undisturbed for 37 years, until a clerk cataloguing estate documents after the judge's death in 1948 found it misfiled under a property survey for a tract of land that did not exist on any parish map. What follows is the deposition as Fontenot gave it, transcribed from the original handwritten record. The board's questions have been omitted, as Fontenot's account was largely continuous, and the questions served mainly to slow him down, which he did not appreciate and said so. He was 34 years old at the time of the events described. He would live to be 65, and according to his surviving daughter, he slept with a lamp burning for the remainder of his life, every night, without exception or explanation to anyone who did not already understand. The iron buckle bearing the initials ED is currently held in the collection of a private individual in Houma who acquired it as part of a lot of estate documents in 1979. That individual declined to be identified. They did confirm, when asked by telephone, that the buckle is still in their possession. They also confirmed, after a pause long enough to be uncomfortable, that they keep it in a glass jar with the lid sealed, because they do not like the way it smells on warm nights. I am setting this on the table in front of you, before I say a single word, the same way I set it in front of those men, so you understand what kind of account this is going to be. That is Edmond Doucet's belt buckle. I pulled it out of the mud myself. You can see where the letters go down, E and D, pressed in clean the way Rougar's shop in Houma used to stamp them, and you can see the mud still in the grooves because I did not clean it. I did not clean it because I thought about cleaning it once, on the walk out, and I decided it was not the kind of thing that deserved to be made tidy. If that does not sit right with this board, I am sorry, but it is how I feel, and I believe feeling it is the only honest thing I have got left. My name is Alcide Fontenot. I am 34 years old. I have hunted the Atchafalaya bottoms since I was 12, first with my father and then with men I chose myself, and in 22 years of working that country, I have never been confused about what I saw or what I heard or what I smelled, and I am not confused now. I am asking this board to write down exactly what I say and not to arrange it afterward to sound more manageable, because I was there, and you were not, and the manageable version of this story is the dishonest one. We went in on a Tuesday, November 7th, 1911. 5 of us, myself, Edmond Doucet, Rémy Trosclair and his brother Claude, and the man we called Petit, who cooked for us every season, and whose other name I confess I only ever half knew. Célestine something, Célestine Broussard maybe, or Brosseau. And I am sorry I cannot do better than that because he deserved better than that, and what happened to him deserves a full name attached to it. Rémy had worked this stretch of the basin before, 2 seasons back, and he knew where the Cain Gut opened up into the slough and where the high ground was, such as it was, because in the bottoms high ground means 3 or 4 feet above the waterline on a still week, not much more. We portaged in light, 2 pirogues, the camping goods, Rémy's 2 hogs in a slatted crate, because Rémy believed a hunting camp without a pig for the last night's supper was a camp that hadn't planned properly. I had never thought about it either way, but Rémy thought about it constantly and with feeling, so we brought the hogs. The camp itself was a platform affair that a previous party had built, probably 8 or 10 years before, maybe more. 4 poles sunk into the slough bottom, a plank floor about 5 feet above the waterline, walls on 2 sides, open on the others. There was a cook fire clearing at the base of the poles, above the waterline on an elevated root mat that the cypress had built up over the years into something close to solid ground, and Remy set the hog crate near the fire clearing, because he said the warmth kept them quieter. The whole camp sat in a stand of old cypress, the kind that has been there long enough that the knees come up around you in every direction like pegs, and past the cypress on the south end, the water opened up into actual slough, black and wide and slow, and the far tree line across that open water was maybe 200 feet off, a solid dark wall of cypress and titi and cane from waterline to canopy. I want to tell you what that country smells like ordinarily, before I tell you what it smelled like after, because the difference is the whole point, and I need you to have the ordinary version in your mind first. Ordinarily, the Atchafalaya bottoms smell like mud and old water, and the particular green rot of cane that has been standing wet for most of its life. There is a sulfur note in it sometimes, when the bottom stirs, and when you are working a stretch that the deer use, you get the musk of them in the mornings, and the damp fur smell of the nutria in the evening. It is not a clean smell, the bottoms. It is a full smell, layered and specific and honestly not unpleasant once you know it well, the way a working man's shop smells particular to his trade, and that particularity is not a bad thing. I knew that smell the way I knew my own hand. I had slept in it and woken up in it for 22 years. The first evening was normal. We set up on the 7th, got the camp in order. Petite built the cook fire and made a rice and sausage that Edmond said was better than what his mother made, which was high praise from Edmond, who did not compliment things easily. Remy walked the perimeter to read sign and came back saying the deer trails were fresh and the duck activity on the open slough was good. And Claude, who was younger than Remy by 4 years and inclined to take his brother's word as gospel, started talking about how many birds he was going to put down tomorrow with considerable enthusiasm. Edmond sat by the fire and sharpened his knife without saying much. Edmond's manner of being quiet was not unfriendly. It was the quiet of a man who was interested in what was around him and did not want to interrupt it. I will tell you now about a thing I noticed that first evening that I did not think enough about. When I walked the south side of the route mat to see the slough before dark, I noticed there were no frogs. That is not ordinary. In November, the frog sign drops off, yes, but it does not go to nothing. There is always some chorus from the far cane, always something. And that evening, there was silence from the water all the way to the far tree line, a silence that was bigger than the season accounted for. I stood there for probably 2 minutes listening to it. Then I went back to the fire and had my supper, and I filed it under nothing, and I wish to God I had filed it under something else. The second night is when it began. We had been in camp since morning that day, working the duckwater from the pirogues in the slough and the near channel, and it had been a good day in the ordinary way of good days. Birds in the decoys before full light, the sound of shots rolling across the open water, cold enough to keep you sharp, but not cold enough to make the work miserable, and by midday we had taken what we needed and come in to dress and hang the birds. Petit had the fire going by 3 o'clock, and the camp smelled of wood smoke, and the sweet, dark smell of duck fat rendering, and everyone was in a good temper. Even Edmond had said a few more words than usual, which for Edmond amounted to what another man might call a conversation. The smell arrived at dusk. Not all at once. It came in the way that bad weather comes in over flat country, something changing at the edges first that you only name in retrospect. I was sitting on the route mat with Remy going over the morning's plan when I became aware that the smell of the cook fire had been overwritten by something else, something sweetish and standing, like fruit that had gone too far past ripe but not into pure rot, hovering at that particular moment just before rot where the sweetness is still there but wrong underneath it. It reminded me of muscadine grapes left in a bucket of water, the way they smell when you come back to the bucket 2 days later and the water has taken on the grape's character but made it heavier, wetter, more insistent, like something blooming that had no business blooming, in water that had no business making things bloom. I noticed it. I did not remark on it right then because I was trying to decide if I was imagining it, the way you hold a sound in your mind for a moment before you mention it, to see if it repeats. It repeated. It grew, in fact, settling over the camp in a slow drift that had no direction I could identify, no source wind, just a presence that established itself in the air around us and stayed. I said to Remy that something smelled off to the south. Remy said it was the slough gas and poured himself more coffee. I let it go because Remy was not a man you could argue into noticing something he had decided not to notice, and I had not yet decided what I was noticing myself. The hogs told me. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, maybe a little after, the 2 hogs in Remy's crate went quiet. Not quiet the way animals go quiet when they settle for sleep, gradually, shifting and settling and breathing down. They went quiet all at once, between one breath and the next, and the silence where they had been shuffling and snuffling was so sudden that Petit, who had been talking across the fire to Claude about something or another, stopped mid-sentence and looked at the crate. We all looked at the crate. The hogs were standing still, both of them, pressed into the far corner of the crate, not against each other the way frightened animals press together for warmth, but side by side facing the same direction. Their snouts pointed south toward the open slough, rigid in that arrested stillness that prey animals go into when they have identified something and have not yet decided whether the thing is close enough to bolt from. I ask that the board note that I have watched hogs in that country for a long time, and I have seen them spooked by gators, by gar rolling near the bank, by nutria in the cane, and by dogs, and in every case they make noise when they are frightened. They squeal and they scramble. They do not go silent. A hog that goes silent has gone past frightened into something that does not have a name I know. Remy went to the crate and spoke to them, and they did not respond to him. He put his hand through the slats and touched the nearer one, and it flinched, but did not make a sound. He stood up with a look on his face that he did not want any of us to see, and said we should all get some sleep. Claude was already looking at the far tree line across the slough. Edmond had picked up his knife from where it was lying and was holding it with no particular urgency, just holding it, the way a man picks something up that he is used to having in his hand. I slept poorly. The smell was still there when I woke in the grey before dawn and went lighter as the morning came up, and by the time Petit had the coffee on it was mostly gone, replaced by the ordinary mud and cane smell of the bottoms. I have since thought about that timing. 30 minutes before the hogs went silent, roughly, was when I first smelled it. It stayed while the hogs stood frozen. It began to thin after midnight, and by dawn it was nearly gone. Whatever the smell signaled, it stayed while whatever made it stayed, and it left when whatever made it left. That much I am sure of, because on every subsequent night it tracked exactly the same way, arriving in advance, peaking at the worst moments, thinning toward dawn. And I want the board to write that down specifically because it means the arrival of that smell was a warning, and on the second night I did not understand it as a warning, and that is a thing I will carry. We found the hogs in the morning, both of them, both necks broken. Not wrung, not mauled, broken cleanly at the base of the skull, and the crate itself undamaged, the slats intact. No blood anywhere, no marking on the ground around the crate. Whatever had reached in and done it, had done it through the slats, or had opened the crate and closed it again. I looked at those hogs for a long time. I have killed hogs myself. I know what a deliberate kill looks like versus what a frenzied kill looks like. This was deliberate. This was practiced. There was no mess because whoever or whatever did it did not need to make a mess. Remy said nothing for several minutes after we found them. Then he said they must have gotten their necks in the slats during the night, and panicked, and broken themselves on the crate frame. Claude agreed immediately. I looked at Edmond, and Edmond looked at me, and neither of us said what we were thinking, which was that 2 hogs do not both get their necks in the slats at the same time, and both break cleanly at the same angle on the same night. Petit had gone back to the cook fire and was frying salt pork with his back turned to us, and I noticed that the salt pork he was frying was from the camp stores and not from the hogs, and I appreciated that instinct in him without being able to say why exactly. I will tell you here that I want to leave. I want to be clear about that for the record. Even then, With only the smell and the hogs, I wanted to leave. Something in me that was older than my opinions about things had already registered what was out there in the slough, and was sending up a clear and unambiguous signal that we should put the pirogues in the water and go. The feeling was not like fear exactly. It was like that moment when you are in the bottoms and the water changes color ahead of you, and you understand without thinking about it that the bottom has dropped out and you are in deep water now, and the right response is to stop moving and figure out how to get back to where you were standing safely. That kind of feeling, the kind that does not require you to understand the specifics before it is right. I told Remy we ought to pull out. I told him the hogs were not what he said they were, and that something was wrong in this part of the slough, and I would rather lose the rest of the season than lose anything else. Remy told me that I was jumpy from a bad night's sleep, and that the hogs had died the way hogs die sometimes, which is stupidly, and that he had put 2 good weeks into planning this camp, and he was not going to pull stakes because the livestock had an accident. Claude said that his brother was right. I looked at Edmond, because Edmond was the one man in the group I trusted to say a true thing without measuring it first for how it would land. Edmond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am going to sleep with this open tonight," meaning the knife, and he held it up briefly so we all saw it. And then he put it in his belt and went to help Petit with the coffee. That was all he said. It was not a vote to leave, and it was not a vote to stay. It was a man telling you what he had decided about his own situation, and in Edmond's case, that was the most honest answer you were going to get. So we stayed, and that night, Petit was gone. I need to be exact about how that happened, or rather about how it did not happen, because the absence of happening is the point. The third night the smell came in right at sundown again, that sweetish standing bloom of something wrong in the water, and it was thicker than the night before. Noticeably thicker, the kind of difference where the night before you were wondering if you were imagining it, and this time you were not wondering. I mentioned it to Edmond, and he nodded. I mentioned it to Remy, and Remy walked to the south edge of the route mat and stood there for a while looking at the slough and came back and said we should make the fire bigger and stay close to it, which was the first concession he had made, that something warranted a response, and I took it as such. Petit's bedroll was at the base of the platform poles, on the route mat, in the lee of the camp. He was a small man, Petit, probably no more than 130 pounds soaking wet, which given the bottoms he generally was. He was a careful and methodical cook who took his work seriously in a way that I respected. He had a particular method of arranging his bedroll in which he tucked the sides under and rolled the top down, and then got in from one specific end, and he always put his boots on a piece of planking he kept for that purpose, so they stayed out of the mud. I am telling you these details because I want you to understand that his bedroll the next morning was still tucked and arranged in his method, the boots still on the planking, the impression of his body in the center of it, and no Petit, no disturbance of the reeds around him, no sign of a struggle or of a man getting up on his own in the night and walking somewhere. His coffee cup was still sitting within arm's reach, half full from the night before. Something had lifted him out of that bedroll so cleanly that the bedroll remembered him and nothing else did. Remy went pale. I mean that in the physical sense. The blood left his face, and his hands were not steady when he picked up Petit's cup and set it down again. Claude kept saying his brother's name, Remy, Remy, without asking anything specific, just saying it the way a young man reaches for the thing that has always been reliable. Edmond squatted down and looked at the ground around the bedroll for a long time. Then he stood up and said he had found one impression in the soft mud at the edge of the route mat, at the place where the roots gave way to open water mud, a single impression that he described to me as wider across than his 2 hands placed side by side. He did not speculate further. He just said that and stood with his arms at his sides, which was the posture Edmond assumed when he had finished saying what he had to say. I will tell you here what I decided and when I decided it. I decided on that morning, looking at Petit's arranged bedroll and his boots on their plank and his half cup of coffee, that the thing in the slough was not going to let us simply leave. I do not know how I knew that. I am not a man given to feelings of that kind, and I want to be clear about that for the record. I have spent most of my adult life in country that is actively trying to kill you in ordinary ways, and I have learned to read the difference between danger and mortal danger. And what I felt looking at Petit's bedroll was mortal danger, of a kind that was also something worse than that. Because ordinary mortal danger has a logic you can work with. This had a logic too, but not one I had a name for. I told Remy we were leaving. I said it flat and direct, and I told him I was not asking his permission. I said we were putting the 2 pirogues in the water and going north up the gut and out of the basin. Remy said, Petit went somewhere in the night and got lost or got into trouble with a gator, and I am not leaving this camp until we look for him. I asked him how he proposed to look for a man in 200 square miles of flooded bottomland with 2 pirogues and 4 men, and what he thought we were going to find. He did not answer that. He got into one of the pirogues and told Claude to get in with him, and they poled out toward the open slough, and I watched them go and felt sick in a way that had nothing to do with my stomach. I want the board to note that I did not go after Petit. That is on me. I have arranged and rearranged the reasons for it in my mind for 9 days, and they all come down to the same thing, which is that some part of me understood that Petit was gone, in the complete sense of the word gone, and that going into the slough to look for him would only add names to the tally. Whether that was clear-headedness or cowardice I have not been able to determine, and I suspect I will not be able to determine it for the rest of my life. We stayed a 4th night. Remy insisted on it, and Claude stood with him, and Edmond was silent, and I was outstood. We kept a fire burning high, and we kept watches, and I took the platform for my sleeping, while the others kept the route mat. The smell arrived at dusk that 4th night, and it was heavier than it had been the 3rd night, by a degree that I can only describe by saying that on the 3rd night I had smelled it as a smell, and on this 4th night I began to experience it as a thing with weight, as if the air itself had thickened and taken on a texture, and breathing it felt like drawing something into your lungs that was not pure air, but was not quite not air either. Something wet and sweet and close to gagging, but not quite there, hanging just below the threshold of unbearable, in a way that I think was worse than if it had crossed that threshold. I climbed to the platform before dark and pulled the ladder up behind me. I did not tell the others I was going to do this. I am not proud of it, but I am telling you the truth of what happened. I had a shotgun and 22 shells, and I told myself I was taking the high ground because it gave me a wider field of fire and the ability to cover the camp better, and that was partly true. The other part of the truth is that I was afraid with my whole body, and the platform was the highest point available to me, and height felt like something, even if I understood dimly that it probably was not something to whatever was in that water. I want to tell you about the platform, specifically about the gap in the planking on the south side. It was about 3 inches wide and ran for maybe 2 feet along one of the boards that had shrunk away from its neighbor, and by lying on my stomach, I could look through it down at the route mat below, and across to the south end of camp and out toward the slough, and that is what I did for the better part of that night. I lay on my stomach on the cold boards, and I watched through that gap, and I listened to the sounds of the men below me, and I breathed that sweet, wrong air, and I waited. Claude was the first to sleep. Remy and Edmond kept the watch, sitting on opposite sides of the fire. The fire burned well and threw good light into the south end of camp, out across the first several feet of the water, enough to show the near cypress knees rising from the black surface, enough to show the cattails and cane at the slough's edge. It was after midnight. I know this because I had a pocket watch, and I had been watching it regularly, the way a man does when time is the thing he has most of and least of simultaneously. The smell peaked. It did not arrive at a new level gradually. It simply reached a point that was different from all previous points, a saturation of the air that I can only describe by saying the sweetness stopped being sweet and became something else, the way a sound can stop being a sound and become a pressure instead. I pressed my face against the planking and breathed through my mouth and watched the south end of camp through that 3-inch gap. The fire had burned down some. Remy had put another piece of wood on it, maybe 40 minutes before, and the new wood was burning steadily, and the light was good enough. Edmund was on the south side of the fire, facing the slough. Remy was on the north side with his back to the water, which I remember noticing and wanting to say something about, that Remy had his back to the water. It came out of the flooded cypress line at the far end of camp, not from the open slough water. From the tree line itself, from the shadow between the trees, which until that moment I had understood as static dark, and which now resolved itself into moving dark. A shape separating from the background shadow in the way shapes do when they have been standing very still for a while and then begin to move, and you realize you were looking at them the whole time and your eyes had categorized them as part of the background. I will describe it as exactly as I can. I have been over it many times in my mind, and I am going to say what I saw without softening it or adjusting it for how it sounds. It was upright. It moved on 2 legs. It was wide across the shoulders in a way that suggested the width was a primary feature rather than incidental, the way a bull's width is a primary feature. Wide enough that when it passed between 2 cypress trees at the edge of camp, the space it moved through was the full space between those trees and not a comfortable fit. In height I cannot say precisely, but I believe it was taller than a tall man. Its color was dark and difficult to separate from the tree shadow it had come out of. Its gait was a rolling, forward-pitched walk, the knees bending differently than a man's knees bend, a quality of the step that made each footfall look like the being was always about to lean forward past the point of balance and was continually catching itself before it did, and this gave the motion a rhythm that was both purposeful and wrong. Its face. I am going to say this, and I am asking the board to write exactly what I say and not to interpret it. The face was long. Too long in the vertical dimension for the width it sat above, elongated from the brow to the jaw in a way that the face of a man is not elongated, with features that were arranged in roughly the correct positions, but in proportions that were not correct, and I understood looking at it that the wrongness was not disease or deformity, but something different, something that had arrived at a face from a different direction than a man arrives at one. The eyes were not visible as distinct features from my height and distance. The jaw was heavy. The thing was wet, or appeared wet, its surface catching the firelight the way wet skin or wet fur catches firelight. It moved into camp without pausing at the perimeter. There was no hesitation in it, no testing, no scouting. It moved like something that had been here before and knew the layout. Claude was asleep on the near side of the fire. Edmund had seen it. I could tell Edmund had seen it because I watched his shoulders change. A very slight change. The kind of change a controlled man makes when his body responds to what his mind is telling it not to respond to visibly. He did not run. He did not shout. He turned his head slightly to locate Remy, and then he looked back at the thing coming into camp. It went to Claude. I am going to say that plainly because there is no other way to say it. It went to Claude, who was asleep, who was lying on his side with his coat pulled up, and it bent over him with that forward pitch of the body, and it took him in what I can only describe as a single organized motion, and Claude made a sound that was short and cut off, not a scream, but the sound that precedes a scream, the intake before the outgoing, and then there was nothing, and the thing had him and was moving back toward the cypress tree line with him. The motion was unhurried. That is the word I keep returning to. It was unhurried in the way that a thing is unhurried when it is not expecting opposition. Remy had turned. He had seen the last of it, the thing at the tree line with his brother, and he made a sound that I do not have a word for, a sound that came from a place inside him that I do not think he knew was there, and he ran. He ran across the root mat toward the cypress tree line, toward the black water, toward where the thing had gone in with Claude, shouting his brother's name at the top of his voice, and at the edge of the water, at the exact place where the roots ended and the slough began, the thing turned. It turned back toward the camp, and it looked directly toward the sound Remy was making, and for what I am going to estimate as 4 seconds, possibly 5, it was fully visible in the dying firelight at a distance of maybe 60 or 70 feet from where I was lying on the platform. I did not fire the shotgun. I want the board to ask me why if they want to, and I will tell them what I know, which is that my body did not fire the shotgun. My body, which had 22 years of experience in the bottoms and which had registered what was in that camp at some level that preceded my thinking mind by a significant margin, did not raise the gun or pull the trigger. I do not know if it was cowardice or calculation or something else. I do not know if a shotgun would have mattered. I tell you this not because I think it changes what happened, but because it is part of what happened, and I am giving you the full account. Remy went into the water after his brother, into the black water of the slough, in November, at night, after the thing that had taken Claude. He went in without hesitating. He was screaming Claude's name, and then the cypress took him, and I could hear him for a while, his voice getting farther, and then I could not hear him. I did not hear either of them again. I lay on the platform for the remainder of that night. I will not tell you I was anything other than what I was, which was a man lying face down on cold boards, doing everything in his power not to make a sound or a movement. The smell began to thin around 3 in the morning. It was largely gone by 4. When grey light came up, I was still on the platform, and the camp below me was as it had been. Fire burned to coals, Claude's bedroll empty, Remy's coat on the ground where he had thrown it in his running. Edmond was sitting against one of the platform poles with his knife in his hand, awake, his eyes open, looking at the slough. I climbed down. Edmond watched me come down without saying anything. I sat with him for a while. The daylight was full and ordinary, and the smell was gone, and the bottoms were just the bottoms, mud and cane, and the distant call of wood ducks on the open water, somewhere to the west. The ordinary world had come back the way it always did, indifferent to what had happened inside it the night before. Edmond said we should leave in the morning. Not today, but tomorrow at first light. He said he needed the day. I asked him what he needed it for, and he said there were things he wanted to do, and asked me to give him that. I agreed. I did not understand what he meant entirely, and I did not ask further, because Edmond's face had the look of a man who had made an accounting with himself that was private, and I respected it. I will tell you that I kept the watch that day and evening alone, and let Edmond do whatever it was he was doing, which seemed to involve sitting at the south end of camp near the waterline for several hours, and sometimes talking in a low voice that I could not hear distinctly. I do not know who or what he was talking to, and I did not go down there to find out. I kept the fire going and I cleaned and loaded the shotgun twice, because it gave my hands something to do, and I watched the tree line on the south end across the open water and waited for the day to pass. The smell came in at dusk. I had been waiting for it and it still hit me in a way that was physical, a contraction of something in the chest, when that first sweetish bloom of it reached me from the south. It was heavy. It was heavier than the night before. Heavier than any previous night, so heavy that within an hour of its arrival, I was aware of it as a constant physical presence in every breath. Not just a smell, but a weight in the air, something that sat on the surface of the water and rose from it continuously. The blooming rot scent of muscadine and standing water, and something underneath that I cannot name, something at the bottom of the smell that had no natural comparison I could reach for. Edmond came back to the fire at dark. He sat across from me. He looked, I thought, like a man who had finished something, though I could not have said what. We did not speak much. We ate from the camp stores. The smell was at its peak by 9 or 10 o'clock, and breathing it that night was exactly the way I told the board. It felt like swallowing something wet, like the air had dissolved into the smell, and you were drinking it rather than breathing it. Not choking, not burning, just the constant sensation of drawing something thick and sweet and wrong into your body with every breath. At some point before midnight, I became aware that Edmond was no longer across the fire from me. He was standing at the south edge of the root mat, at the waterline, looking across the slough. He was not holding the knife. I stood up and said his name. He did not answer me, but he turned his head slightly to indicate he had heard me. I started toward him, and he raised one hand, palm out, without looking at me, a gesture that meant clearly, "Stay there." I stopped. I do not know why I stopped. I stopped because it was Edmund, and in 20 years of knowing the man I had learned to trust his information about what he required, and what he was requiring in that moment was for me to stay where I was. I stayed where I was. I am going to tell you what I heard and what I did not hear, and then what I found, and I am asking the board to record all of it. What I heard: Edmund spoke one word, sharp, direct, the kind of word you say when you are addressing something you have decided to address. I could not make out the word. It was not a name I knew. Then silence. Not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of something complete. The smell peaked at that moment. It reached a level that had no relationship to anything I had experienced on any of the previous nights. An absolute saturation. And then it began to thin, rapidly, in a way that felt like a physical departure, like something leaving the area and taking its signature with it as it went. Within 20 minutes it was thin. Within 30 it was gone. The air was clean bottomland air, mud and cane and cold water, and the frogs had started up somewhere on the far side of the open slough. The frogs. I noted that specifically because I had not heard frogs in this part of the slough since the first night. When light came, I went to the waterline. The mud there was soft and disturbed in the way mud is disturbed when something large has stood in it or moved through it. There were impressions that I would describe to this board as very large and deep, and not attributable to any animal I know, and they went from the waterline back into the black water of the slough and did not come back. There was no blood. There was nothing of Edmund. There was, pressed into the mud at the exact edge of the water, at the place where the slough mud met the root mat, one iron belt buckle with the initials ED stamped into its face. I picked it up. I held it in my palm. It was muddy, and it was cold, and it was all that was left. I put it in my coat pocket. I broke down the camp alone. I took one pirogue, and I left the other tied where it was. I do not know why. Some feeling that leaving the camp completely empty of boats felt wrong in a way I could not explain. He pulled north up the gut and found the channel, and pulled out of the basin, and it took me the better part of 2 days, and I will tell you that on the first night of the transit, alone on the water, I smelled it briefly, once, very faint, from somewhere behind me and to the south, and then it was gone, and it did not come back. I walked into the parish seat 9 days after we went in. I went to the courthouse, and I asked for whoever took depositions, and they gave me a clerk, and I told the clerk that 5 men went into Cane Gutslow on November 7th, and 1 came out, and I needed to make a formal record. The Board of Inquest was convened 3 days later. I wore my best coat to that hearing, and I set Edmund Doucet's buckle on the table in front of the board before I said a single word, and I left it there the whole time I was talking, so they would understand that what I was going to say was as real and as heavy as iron, and that 4 men deserved to be taken seriously, and that whatever they decided about the plausibility of my account, I was not going to alter one word of it to make it easier for them to write down. That is my account. That is the full account. I have left out nothing of material significance. I swear to its accuracy on whatever oath this board requires of me. There is one thing I want to say at the end that is not strictly part of the account. I have thought, in the 9 days since I came out, about why I am still here, and the others are not. I have not been able to arrive at any satisfying answer. I did not do anything to deserve survival, and the others did not do anything to deserve otherwise. Remy was bull-headed, but he ran into that water for his brother, which is not a failing. Claude trusted his brother, which is not a failing either. Petit cooked us the best camp meals I have ever had in 22 years of the bottoms, and he died without making a sound. And whatever went and took him from that arranged bedroll, I think he did not suffer the terror of knowing what was coming. And I am glad of that much, which is about as much gladness as I can manage. And Edmund. Edmund, who sat at the waterline and said whatever he said to whatever was listening, and was taken cleanly, without a struggle I could hear, and left his buckle in the mud like a receipt, or a note, or something I cannot name. I carry the buckle because setting it down somewhere permanent would mean deciding he was finished. I am not ready to decide that. I do not know that I will ever be ready. I know that the Atchafalaya Basin is still there, and whatever is in Cain Gutslow is still there, and I know the smell of it now the way I know my own hand, that sweetish wrong bloom of it, and I will know it if I ever smell it again. I hope I do not smell it again. I think about Edmond every day, and Rémi going into the black water after Claude, and Petit's boots on their plank. I think about the thing at the tree line in the firelight, turning back toward Rémi's voice, and I think about the 4 seconds I lay on that platform with the shotgun and did not fire. I do not know what those 4 seconds cost, or saved. I have been trying to figure it out for 9 days, and I expect I will be trying for a good while longer. The buckle is on the table. If the board is finished with me, I would like it back. The Inquest Board of Terrebonne Parish convened on November 19, 1911, and concluded its deliberations on the same day, which is to say it opened and closed in a single afternoon. The session ran from 9 in the morning until shortly before 3, at which hour the presiding judge signed the closing order, and the 4 deaths were entered into the parish record as the result of a kerosene fire, cause accidental, no further inquiry warranted. The sole survivor's testimony was noted in the session log as having been received and considered. The word considered does not appear to have troubled anyone in the room. There was no fire. The physical record of the camp, to the extent that a follow-up party examined it 5 days after Fontenot walked out, contained no evidence of a fire. The cook hearth showed normal use. The platform structure was intact. The camp stores, still present and undisturbed in their oilcloth wrapping, included 3 full kerosene tins, sealed. The follow-up party's own notes from that site visit were not entered into the inquest record. They were found attached to the back of an unrelated timber survey in the parish clerk's overflow storage in 1952, and the notation at the bottom of those notes, in handwriting identified by 2 subsequent analysts as belonging to the inquest's presiding judge, reads, "This does not go in." The deposition itself, 41 handwritten pages, was not destroyed. Destruction would have created its own kind of record. Instead, it was sealed under the judge's personal order, classified as material pertaining to an active inquiry, and placed in a cedar box that was logged not under Fontenot's name or under the names of the dead men, but under a case number that corresponded to no other file in the courthouse records, as if the number itself had been invented for the purpose of making the box unfindable, without already knowing what you were looking for. The game warden who took Fontenot's initial statement before the inquest was convened, a man named Arsenault who had served in Terrebonne Parish for 11 years, and who by every available account was thorough and well regarded, was reassigned to a posting in northern Caddo Parish within 30 days of the inquest's close. The reassignment paperwork cited a staffing need in the northern region. Caddo Parish was 5 hours north of everything Arsenault knew and had built. He filed no formal objection. A letter from him to a colleague, recovered from that colleague's estate decades later, says only that he had been advised that his familiarity with the southern parishes was no longer considered an asset. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The 4 dead men received individual entries in the parish death register. Doucet, Edmond, cause unknown, body not recovered. Trosclair, Rémi, cause unknown, body not recovered. Trosclair, Claude, cause unknown, body not recovered. Celestine Broussard, cause unknown, body not recovered. The cause listed for all 4 was subsequently amended by a second hand, in a different ink, to read, "Fire, accidental, consistent with inquest finding." Someone went back through the register after the inquest closed and made the record agree with the ruling. This was not an accident of paperwork. Paperwork does not correct itself. Someone made time to do this. Someone had a reason to want the register and the ruling to agree, and that reason was not record-keeping accuracy, because record-keeping accuracy would have required noting that no fire occurred. The hollow at Cain Gutslow was logged in the parish land survey the following spring as uninhabited and unsuitable for development. Value rated flat, no further notation. The survey assessor's name on that entry is the same name as the inquest's presiding judge. This could mean a great deal, or it could mean nothing. What it does mean, concretely, is that a man who knew exactly what Alcide Fontenot had described in that room was also the man who assessed the land and found nothing worth noting. Fontenot was not called back to testify. He was not interviewed again by the parish. He was not harassed or threatened in any way that left a record, which may mean he was left alone, or may mean that whatever pressure was applied to him was the kind that does not leave a record. He lived in Houma for the remaining 31 years of his life, and he hunted other country, and he slept with a lamp burning. His daughter, in a brief statement given to the researcher who first located the deposition in 1948, said that her father spoke of the incident only once in her presence, when she was 17, and what he said was that 4 men deserved to be remembered by their proper names and not by a word like fire, and that he had tried to give them that and been unable to, and that he was sorry for it. He was still carrying the buckle when he died in 1942. His daughter found it in his coat pocket when she went through his things, and she understood at once what it was, and why he had kept it, and why she could not throw it away, and she did not. Whatever the silence at Cain Gutslow served, it served consistently. No subsequent report of an incident at that location entered the official record for the remaining decades of the 20th century. That absence is not the same thing as nothing happening there. It may be the record of a different kind of arrangement, one in which the lesson of November 1911 was applied broadly and quietly, that certain stretches of the southern bottomland are not to be entered, and that the way you communicate this without saying it is to make what happened the last time someone entered look like a kerosene fire and send the man who knows the truth to a posting 5 hours north. The arrangement holds better when no one is asking about it. For 37 years, no one was. Cain Gutslow is still there. It is accessible by water from the main channel of the Atchafalaya, roughly 12 miles south of the point where the gut opens off the main basin, and it is navigable by pirogue in any month of the year when the water is running normally, which in southern Louisiana it generally is. The cypress stand at the south end of the slough is old-growth timber that has not been cut, and it has not been cut not because it lacks value, but because the timber surveys of the region consistently noted the parcel as unsuitable and moved on. A pattern that holds across 6 separate surveys conducted between 1911 and 1974, as if each assessor arrived at the conclusion independently, and none of them felt the need to explain it. The platform structure erected by unknown parties at some point before 1911 is gone. The poles rotted out by the 1930s, most likely. The root mat remains. Root mats in old cypress stands do not go anywhere on any human timeline. In the spring of 2004, a wildlife photographer working the basin for a magazine assignment reported to the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries that he had encountered what he described as an extremely strong and unusual odor in the vicinity of Cain Gutslow, sweetish and wrong, his words, which he was unable to attribute to any natural source he could identify. He filed the report because he felt it warranted documentation. The department's response, dated 3 weeks later, noted that the odor was likely attributable to seasonal plant decay consistent with the region, specifically late-flowering aquatic vegetation, and recommended no follow-up action. The photographer's follow-up letter, in which he noted that November was not a flowering month and that he had worked southern bottomland for 9 years and had never encountered this particular smell, received no response. The iron buckle with the initials ED is held in a private collection in Houma. The collector keeps it in a sealed glass jar. On warm nights, they say, it smells. The body of Edmond Doucet was never located, nor were the others. If you are reading this record now, or listening to it, you should understand that the slough is not a historical site. It is not a place where something happened. It is a place where something lives, and has lived for longer than the records that tried to contain it, and will continue to live after every document connected to Alcide Fontenot's deposition has crumbled into the same mud that took his friends. The official record says fire. Fontenot said otherwise for 31 years, in a coat pocket, in the weight of an iron buckle, in a lamp that burned all night every night until he did not wake up to light it anymore. He never went back to Caen Gutzlau. He also never, by his daughter's account, stopped thinking of it as a place that was waiting for him to come back. Those are not the same feeling, and only one of them is reassuring, and it is not the second one. The smell is the thing you should remember. If you are ever in the southern bottoms in November, on still water, in the evening, and the air changes in a particular way, and what you smell is sweetish and wrong and close to blooming, like something fermenting in standing water, heavier than it has any right to be, arriving on air that has no wind behind it. That is 30 minutes. Maybe less. That is the margin Fontenot measured and survived by, and he was not certain, even at the end of his life, whether surviving it had been the better outcome or simply the longer one.